Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel and another Calvine update. This time it's a Q&A. So as you can see, I am joined by some friends and colleagues who have been working on the case. And one thing I'll say quickly is we have had an awful lot of questions sent before the show, which we've kind of collated into some talking points, which we'll start off with. So, and we're going to do it in parts. So the initial first part will be focusing on the photograph analysis, and we'll move then through into the location and so on and so forth. So if we're talking about the photo analysis, if you've got questions about the photo analysis, pop them into the live chat. We're in capitals. If your questions about a different aspect, we will get to that a bit later on, because I might miss some questions, but I will do my best. So before we get to the first talking point, if you gentlemen don't mind introducing yourselves, who you are and how you became interested in the Calvine case. Thank you.
I'm Graeme Rendall. I'm a member of UAP Media UK, so I'm one of Vinny's colleagues. I am an author of aviation history books, UFO history books, and a podcaster. I do an unidentified aerial podcast with Dave Partridge. My interest in Calvine started shortly after 1996 when Nick Pope first came up with the story in one of his books and went from there.
Thank you. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Robinson. I'm a senior lecturer in photography at Sheffield Hallam University, and I work with David Clarke and our colleague Diane Rogers as part of the Centre for Contemporary Legend. This is a research group investigating legend, folklore, custom, and its representation in different media. I've got 34 years of experience working in both analog and digital photography, and I'm interested in the evidential nature of documentary photographs and how photographs are read and interpreted. I've only recently become involved in the Calvine case when David asked me to copy the photograph as soon as he had obtained it from Scotland and before it was deposited in the university's special collection archive.
Thank you. Dave.
Yep. I think you've summarised quite a lot of info there, Andrew. Yes, so I'm David Clarke, Associate Professor in Journalism and Media at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm part of the same research group as Andrew. People will probably know I've been writing and broadcasting about UFOs and related anomalous subjects, Fortean subjects, I think you'd summarise it as, for the last 30-odd years, certainly since I was a teenager. I've published more books than I can remember. I was involved in the National Archives project that released something like 210 Ministry of Defence files into the public domain, which ran between 2008 and 2013. And that really is when I first sort of became properly aware of the Calvine incident. I mean, I had read the two-sentence mention in Nick Pope's book, but I hadn't really taken much notice of it. And it wasn't until I remember now, the day I was reviewing the files, I think it was 2009, because I saw all the files months ahead of their being released to the public. And I saw that image, you know, the famous crop one that's now been superseded by the real one, and just thought, bloody hell, that's the Calvine UFO. So at that point, that's when I started thinking, yeah, this is one that's worth following up, and we'll perhaps talk about what I actually did back in 2009. So when I was talking to Craig about this, he was saying, well, I've had this for 32 years. And I said, well, not quite as much as you, Craig, but I've been involved for 13 years. So that's how I got involved.
Giles.
Hi, yes, I'm Giles Stevens. So I live a mile away from Calvine. I've probably been dealing with this for about a year, I think. It was about a year since Dave contacted me, so I've sort of helped with some of the local stuff, some of the locations, including we've been out up to various points locally together earlier in the year. I first was aware of the case, I think, a few years ago, but it was in the local press a couple of years ago, another appeal for information. So that's where I became more interested in it. And then Dave, through social media, sort of asked for some sort of local assistance. So that's when I got involved.
Fantastic. And finally, Matthew.
Hi all, my name's Matthew Illsley. In April 2021, I came across the Calvine case in the tabloid media. I messaged David Clarke as a result of seeing the articles and seeking clarification as to what was in the files, what wasn't, and what was ultimately going to be released. And I basically got swept down the rabbit hole along with the rest of us. Everything just began to began to pull at this thread. And lo and behold, after a year and a half, we managed to succeed in getting the photograph.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you for that, guys. So let's start. So I think initially, Andrew, if you'd like to give us your sort of small presentation and to discuss the analysis, that would be a good point to start, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen.
Sure.
So hopefully you can all see.
There we go.
This. Yep. Okay. So as I explained, David asked me if I would copy the photograph originally. And so we met on the afternoon following his return from Scotland. And I produced both photographic copies and high resolution scans of the image itself, the envelope that it was sent to Craig in, and photocopies that I believe were produced at the time in order to fax a copy of the image to London. The high resolution scans resulted in this is a copy of this. This is when we were actually scanning it in a 2.14 gigabyte image. So it's a very detailed file. Unfortunately, the image itself doesn't have great detail in it because it's only a 10:8 print, but nevertheless we can zoom in. And I took still photographs so that we can make comparisons. So if there's anything that's a result of the scanning process, dust on the screen or anything like that, we can sort of double check against a photographic print. When I was doing this, I was kind of saying to David, "Oh, well, have you noticed this? Have you noticed that?" And in the end, I ended up doing a kind of a detailed analysis that I think David then it fed into your article a little bit as well, didn't it, David? And certainly, it's been I think it's been shared by Vinny, and it's kind of people have responded to some of the points that I made, and I thought I'd now briefly cover some of these key points relating to the print. So what's important to realize is that whilst the image is printed on color paper and it has a slight sepia tone, it's a print from a black and white negative. A color negative printed on color paper would not produce a black and white image, no matter how you adjusted the color filtration during printing. We also know this from the back stamp. So this is a back stamp. It's a big enlargement and usually it's quite faint, but this is a back stamp that covers the photographic paper, and this is this fits the era and color paper produced by Kodak, and the image also has a print number on its back. This is a print number. This hasn't been released before. I've been looking into this, but unfortunately this number doesn't include a date. It just gives the enlarger settings and various data codes, the number of the machine, and these can be preset by the lab that's printing it. And in this case, I would assume that the printer was in-house at the Daily Record, that they'd have a Minilab printer to produce this print. Surface abrasions on the print. So in the center here, we see the Calvine print. And on the left and the right are other prints of roughly the same era, which I've scratched the surface of. And you get a very similar result. This is what you get when you scratch color emulsion. You kind of get this pinky, yellowy coloring, which is not the paper base. It's kind of the layer of emulsion beneath the image layer. So this is all consistent with it being a color print. And in addition, there's a little spot up the top left-hand corner of the print, which appears in this kind of turquoise green color. And I'm struggling to really know what this is, other than if it is an area of undeveloped paper. So color paper, when you take it out of the box in daylight, which you should never do, of course, because you're ruining it, but it's got a turquoise green base color. And I'm wondering if there was something attached to the surface of the paper here, which stopped the paper being processed at this point. And that's a little bit of undeveloped paper. So all of this is consistent with it being a print on color paper produced on a Minilab machine. So not a darkroom hand print, but something produced on a Minilab, the kind of Minilab that you'd have in a high street store. And they can produce images up to 10:8 in size. So I'm confident this is a print made from a black and white negative on color paper. Now, there's two different possible types of film that might produce the print. The first is traditional silver-based photography, black and white films such as HP5 or Kodak Tri-X or any of the other black and white films. And the other possible film is Ilford XB1 or XB2, which is a chromogenic film, which you process in C41 color chemistry. And originally, I thought this might be a likely choice because it was a color print. So XB1, you process in color chemistry, and then you would print it onto color paper. And it was introduced in the 1980s by Ilford because, and it became quite popular in the 90s because a lot of labs didn't process black and white film anymore. So this was a way of shooting black and white imagery and getting it processed in a high street lab. However, when I've done a closer analysis of the grain, the original print in the center here, if I zoom in a bit, looks much more like the grain structure of a traditional black and white film rather than the grain structure of XB1 or XB2, which is much finer and a different kind of grain. So it's looking more like traditional film, but perhaps coarser grain than FP4, which is 100 ISO film. So I think it's probably a 400 ISO film. We don't know, but that's my interpretation. Next, if I can just go on to the next slide. In the print, especially along the lower edge where there is a fence and fence posts, you can see evidence of chromatic aberration. Now, what this is a kind of a color fringing either side of an object with a kind of a bluish fringe on the right-hand side here and a magenta fringe on the left-hand side. And this is produced at the edge of an image due to the dispersion of the lens, which results in light of different wavelengths being focused at different points, especially around the edges of images. And this is generally produced by cheap lenses. And you wouldn't expect to see chromatic aberration around an image in the center of the frame, because this is an effect that you see really at the edges of frames, at the edges of images. And as this is a black and white image, this chromatic aberration must be a result of the enlarging lens, not the camera lens, because it's a black and white image. So it's probably a poor quality enlarging lens, and that would be probably expected on a mini lab. You know, if it was a darkroom print and you were using a high quality enlarger lens, you shouldn't be getting this. Okay, next. If we move on just to look at the photograph and consider the scene that it depicts, it looks as though the camera is pointing slightly upwards with the overcast sky filling the majority of the frame. Now, I know when this was reproduced in the newspaper, the sky almost went pure white. But believe me, there are clouds in there. And if you darken the image down, you can see the shapes of cloud formations. So it's an overcast sky. And as you can see, there's a fence running along the lower edge of the frame and what appears to be a landscape visible behind. Now, there's been some debate about this, but I believe that there's a landscape behind the fence in the lower section of the image. There's also an unexplained darkening of the image in the lower right-hand corner. So you can see the image is slightly darker in the lower right-hand corner. And I can't explain this. Two types of branches are coming into the frame from the top. And in the center of the image is this unexplained, unknown diamond-shaped object behind which appears to be a plane flying from right to left in the image. And I'd say from the field of view of the image, it's likely that the photograph was produced not using a standard lens, unless this is a severe crop of the original negative, but using a lens with a focal length of maybe 80 to 120 mil, a mid telephoto lens. It could have been produced on an SLR or on a compact point and shoot camera with a zoom lens. And it's worth mentioning that affordable, reasonable quality compact cameras with zoom lenses were very popular in the early 90s. As far as I'm concerned, the image shows no evidence of negative or print-based manipulation, and all visible signs suggest that this is a genuine photograph of something in front of the camera. So just going on now, if that's okay, Vinny, I was going to go on and talk about some of the key areas of the image, and starting with the fence at the bottom. And the fence there appear to be a number of posts, probably wooden posts, along the bottom of the frame. There's a thinner post that is possibly a metal post, like a metal stake, towards the left. And here we can see two of what I'm calling the wooden posts. And what we appear to be seeing here is a single wire strung along close to the top of these posts, and then below that another wire which has got kind of these darker, regular dark areas along it. And on the upper wire there are a couple of dark areas that we can see the arrows pointing to. These are possibly something that's become attached to the fence. Maybe it's wool from sheep, or maybe it's some grass that's got caught there. Obviously, it's impossible to say, but there's something there, and there appears to be, in this one here, something hanging down below it here, but that's quite blurred. And I'm not really seeing anything hanging down below that one. Let's just zoom out. Now, this is the section of the photograph that is showing the second wire, which I'm assuming to be barbed wire fence. I went out and took some photos of barbed wire fence, intentionally out of focus, and as the image got increasingly out of focus, the barbs disappeared, and you just got these regular blobs of a darker color, a darker density along the wire. And let me get, where am I? Yeah. Typical barbed wire fence. I looked into this. I looked on a few agricultural websites, and most barbed wire fence has a common spacing of 10 centimeters between the barbs. So this can produce or provide a scale at this point in the photograph, because we can measure the distance and count how many barbs there are between the fence posts, and that gives us a sense of scale in the image. The fence posts and wire appear blurred, and this doesn't look like movement blur, because the blur is kind of fairly equal around both the lateral wires and the fence posts, and so I'm assuming this is blur due to the fence being out of focus in the foreground of the image. Now, this is an area that there's been quite a bit of debate online about, so I'm going to give you my reading of what we see behind the fence. I believe that there's a ridge. Now, the top two images that we're looking at here, I've just darkened slightly. It's just a simple, I've just turned the density down on the image just to make it a little bit easier to see. And what I'm seeing here is, you can see that there appears to be a line, and I've drawn it in yellow on the top image, along the image, coming to a peak here, and then dropping down and coming to another peak behind this fence post, and then kind of, I'm not sure where it goes here. There's a line here, but I'm not reading that as being a continuation of this, although it could be. And I'm reading this as a distant landscape, and it's lighter than what appears to be a ridge here, which is closer to the camera, and that would be due to atmospheric dispersion. Sort of successive ranges of hills, the further they are away from you, will appear lighter. And down here, this appears to be this dark area here, I'm reading as a ridge with little groups of trees on, and I've marked the ridge in brown and the trees in green there. And then this line here, I've named it a field boundary. I don't know if that's what it is. It's impossible to say. But to my eye, if I zoom in a bit, this line in the background appears a lot sharper than whatever is hanging down from this dark area on the upper fence. So that appears sharper. And this peak here, the border between an area of light background and this area of darker background, this line appears sharper to my eye than the fence wire. So I'm reading that as you see in the top image here, as being the horizon, an undulating horizon with groups of trees, a ridge in the sort of slightly in front of the rear horizon with trees on it. Now, some people have suggested that this undulating darker area here could be some kind of mesh attached to the fence, rabbit mesh, because it seems to be hanging from the fence posts. That is possible, but my instinct here, and it's only instinct and interpretation, is that this background line appears sharper than the fence to my eye. And certainly here, this line appears sharper than the blurred thing hanging down there. So my interpretation of this, and I know it's contentious for some people, is that what we're seeing through the fence is the distant horizon. And certainly this definitely looks like a ridge with trees on it. And there appears to be a bush much closer to the camera here. So I've just got a couple of, I've tried adjusting the density and the contrast to bring more detail, but there's very little detail beyond what you can see here. So that's the fence. Now, the unidentified object in the center of the frame is the thing that's in best focus in the image. That's in the sharpest focus. So if we accept my analysis that the fence is in the foreground and it's out of focus, and in the distance we either have this ridge here or we have the background horizon, both of which are sharper than the fence, then that positions the unidentified object somewhere between the fence and the background, rather than in front of the fence. If it was in front of the fence, a number of different interpretations might be made, but I'm seeing it as being someplace behind the fence. This would rule out the possibility of this being a small cutout attached to glass in front of the camera or dangling on invisible thread closer to the camera. If the object is some form of cutout or a kite or a radio controlled plane or whatever it might be, it must be much larger and somehow behind the fence, based on my reading. It's worth noting that the image was produced before digital compositing was a possibility for the general public. Adobe Photoshop was launched in 1990, but it wasn't until the introduction of LES with version 3.0 in 1994 that you could really get into compositing. It was pretty basic, the original launch of Photoshop. Before digital compositing, the way you might achieve this if you were wanting to fake it would be to produce a print of the background and then produce a print of the unknown craft with the same kind of viewpoint and the same lighting. You then cut that out carefully, attach it to the background image, retouch around it to try and disguise the join, and then rephotograph it onto a new piece of film, ideally with a higher ISO, so you got more grain, and that would help further disguise the join. And I'd say that at the time the image was produced in 1990, this would be a pretty difficult and complex process. It's a kind of thing you'd require professional skills and equipment to achieve. And so whilst this is possible, I'd say it's highly unlikely. And the grain across the object is very even and continuous. So there's no evidence to my eye of this being a composite image or a cutout. Just moving on to the plane, if we can. So this blurred object in the background, which we're interpreting as a plane, does match the outline of a Harrier, although obviously it's so blurred and distant that it's hard to be sure.
That's a Sea Harrier showing there. So it's a Sea Harrier FRS-1. The image looks more like a GR-1, which is a slightly different type of Harrier, but it's essentially this pretty much the same aircraft. It's just the nose is slightly different.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that, Graeme. The image is blurred, and it could be focus blur, but from where it is in the photograph and looking at how it appears here, I'm reading that as not being focus blur. It looks as though it's got lateral movement blur. So now, oops, where's my page? So just let me get my notes.
Yeah, no worries.
Now, if we were to assume, just for argument's sake, that the unidentified object was in the same plane as the Harrier, then it's 4 1/4 Harriers long, which I believe is about 60 meters. I've just lost my piece of paper. I just need to go get mine.
Yeah, no worries. We will be discussing the Harrier or the jet fighter part in a little bit more detail in a little while, so we're not just going to brush over it. This is more about the photo analysis.
Yeah. So that would give a length of the object of 60 meters if it was in the same plane as the Harrier in the background. That's using a length of the Harrier of 14.4 meters, which, depending on what Harrier it is, it might be slightly different. Also, given that we have a scale in the foreground with a barbed wire fence, and we know the length of the Harrier in the background, you can make some very, very approximate estimations of what the size of this object might be if it is behind the fence. And my calculations are that if it was a third of the way between the fence and the Harrier in the background, it would be 20 meters long. And if it was halfway between the fence and the Harrier in the background, it would be approximately 30 meters long. Okay, so I'm sure we'll come back to talk about the Harrier and so on later, but that was my analysis of it. Now, some commentators have suggested that the image is actually a reflection in a lake and that we should invert it like this to view it. Now, whilst this is a possible explanation, I'm not ruling it out. I feel that there's some serious difficulties with the reading of the image in this way. So if this was an inversion and the this diamond-shaped object was actually a triangular piece of wood or a triangular rock protruding through the surface of a lake, then what we should be seeing is a mirror image in the water. And this is an inverted enlargement of the unidentified object, and it's not a mirror image. There are differences. There's a kind of raised area here which isn't mirrored here, and there are differences in the density, and I'm not seeing that as a pure mirrored image. And in this image, I've darkened the image so that we can see the clouds better, and the mirror stillness with not a single ripple, the lack of any surface debris, any leaves, any twigs, any bubbles, or anything else on the surface, whilst not impossible, I'd suggest is highly unlikely. And unless the lake was on high ground, then we should be seeing a reflection of the landscape beyond the lake here. So if this was, some people have suggested that it might be a specific lock in a valley bottom. Well, if this lake was in a valley bottom and this was a fence on the far side of it, then we should be seeing a landscape, the other side of the valley, reflected here. So I'm not convinced by that. I also feel it's unlikely that a single viewpoint could produce this image. I mean, if you zoom in on that, it maybe you could see that as a reflection. But the whole image, I'm not convinced by it. And I kind of tried to create an image which felt more natural. And by adding a perspective to the fence area of the image, the top area, and adding a different perspective to these branches, I think to my eye, that looks more believable. But that doesn't feel right in terms of its perspective and its depth. So I'm not seeing it as a reflected image. Some people have also suggested that it's actually, it should be viewed this way up, but we're still looking at a reflection in a lake. And if I was to zoom in and we were just to look at that, it does feel like it could be some wood or a rock sticking out from a lake surface. And someone suggested that this might be a rowboat with a person in it. But if that was the case, this is a massive rock protruding from the lake, given the scale, the relative scale. But I can kind of almost see that as a lake. But then when you introduce the fence in the bottom, the perspective again falls apart. So just in kind of concluding, I feel that if we just look at the photograph as an image, aside from the difficulty of explaining what this thing in the middle of it might be, the photograph, to my eye, stands as a convincing image of a highland landscape. And all of the alternative explanations that I've read seem to be attempts to explain the presence of this unidentified object in the center of the image, but they create other problems with the rest of the image. To my mind, the most convincing explanation is that there is something flying in the sky above this highland landscape, and that this was captured directly on film by an unknown photographer. What the object is, I can't say, but I think the image itself feels very, very genuine. So that's the end of my bit, Vinny.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that covers everything. And now, obviously, you're talking about the background and landscaping that you think you can see there, which would lead me now into what Giles wanted to talk about, but he's been having some connection issues. So what we'll do now, if it's okay with Graeme, is we can just show a few images of the Harrier, Graeme, if you're happy to talk about it.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, there's Giles. We'll bring Giles in. Giles would just, actually, should we do Giles while he's still got a connection again?
Yeah, sorry, guys. This is
no, it happens. It happens
for you. Yeah.
So
sorry
let
about
me.
that. I'll do my best. But you are breaking up quite a bit. So can you hear me now?
Can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay. So this is just a local terrain map. I don't know if you can see the small blue cross. That is, or was the location of the reconstruction photo. I guess we could call it the Nick Pope one that we've all seen for the last 15 years or so. So I mean, that's literally 400 meters from Calvine, very close, 5-10 minute walk. The red cross that you can see slightly to the southwest is called Struan Point. Now that's a sort of 45 minute walk from Calvine. It's at a lot higher elevation than the other side. There's also a small there's a green sort of squared area, and that's a wood to the north called Clunes Wood, which is about 1.5 miles from Calvine. So that was another potential area that we looked at. So that's the sort of area we've looked at. We've obviously considered that, you know, these guys were walking in the evening. How many miles would they have been able to get from Calvine if they parked in Calvine, you know, before it got dark? So I don't know if there's another image, Vinny, if you can still hear me.
Yep, the next one I've got.
Yeah.
Oh, he says. There we go. Here's the Nick Pope recreation. Yeah.
So that's what you see in front of you is Glengarry, effectively. So this was taken, literally, I said 5-10 minutes walk north of Calvine. Calvine is actually at the base of the glen in front of you, completely out of sight.
That's where we made that little film, isn't it?
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So this was taken from the Wade Military Road, the General Wade's Military Road, which was basically the first road through the Scottish Highlands, built in the 1730s, I think. It used to take troops up to Fort George and near Inverness. So this is at an elevation of about 800 feet. What you can see across from there is slightly, you can see a snowy mountain to the right. That's Schiehallion, one of the local Munros. That's Glen Ericty behind the first hill that you see, the sloping hill, which takes you up to Struan Point. I don't know if you can go on to the next one, Vinny. So that's it. So that sloping hill, that little copse of trees at the top, that's Struan Point. So this is the military road. As I said, this is the first road through the Highlands, and this is where the reconstruction photo was taken. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of difference between the actual image and the reconstruction, albeit the craft and the plane are very, very similar, but the reconstruction has a clear background but no real major foreground, where obviously the real image has a clear foreground of a fencing and not much of a background. Did you want to move on, Vinny, if you can still hear me? Yeah, so this is just an idea of some of the fencing to the north. you can probably see the posts very close together. This is probably only one of a couple of examples of fencing to the north, which might explain why can we call it Nick Pope's reconstruction? Why there weren't any fencing. There isn't any fencing in the reconstruction photo at all. Maybe because he couldn't find any, because there's sort of remnants of fencing. This isn't uncommon. You'd expect fencing from 1990 to still be around. I mean, this particular fencing could well be over 100 years old. I mean, you don't tend to take it away. You just tend to, as you can see in the foreground, you put new fencing in front of the old fencing. It's too costly to take old fencing away. So that's why we were quite hopeful of trying to find a location with the fencing in the real image. Did you want to move on, Vinny, to the next one? Yeah. So again, that's looking south to where, very close to where the reconstruction image has the craft in the sky. And as you can see, it's quite a lot lower down. As Andrew pointed out, there is a background, but it's very low in the image, which suggests that the photo was probably taken at a reasonably high elevation. So, as I said, this is very, very close to Calvine. So it's just to give you all an idea of scale. You have a lot. You can see a lot of sort of granite stone in front of you, which, as I said, was used to build the first road through Scotland. A lot of it is still there. So that's the original road from. So you're looking at nearly 300 years of history in front of you. Very little changes. So posts from 32 years ago, are invariably will probably be still there. Did you want to go to the next one, Vinny? Right, again, so this is Clunes Wood. That was the sort of shaded green area in that terrain picture that we saw at the beginning. So this is the main road through Scotland. This is the General Wade Road. I've sort of looked at this as a possibility because apparently they took the picture. They sort of hid in a wood because they got a bit scared of what was in front of them. So I looked at that because this is one of only a few wooded areas close to Calvine, and so this is slightly to the northwest of Calvine. If you could go on again, Vinny. So this is the posts that are on the edge of that wood you've just seen, Clunes Wood, and I think you can see from that they don't really match what we have on the real image. They're a lot higher than the real image. I think what we're dealing with in the real image is sheep fencing, because I see it all the time, normally on lower ground. There is another image, Vinny, if you can go on. So that's from the inside of the wood looking out to give you that perspective. And as you can see, it doesn't really match, and there's very little of that fencing in that wood. There's a little bit that goes further up, and that's it. So I think I could discount that from our sort of inquiries when we were looking at potential locations. Did you want to go on again, Vinny, to the next one? Right, so now we're up at we're across the glen. So now we're up at Struan Point, which is probably some of the images you've seen recently. So that's looking due south, and if you've got a peak. If you go on to the next one, Vinny. So that peak is just an enlargement of that one you've just seen. So that is Farragon Hill, which is about, I think, 7 or 8 miles in the distance. I think someone did a very sort of clever, I think a fellow called Gordon did a little online demo and thought it might be the object sort of reflected maybe that peak appearing above cloud cover. So that's in the distance, but I think, as you can see from that, it probably doesn't really match the shape of the object when you zoom in. Did you want to go on again? Oh yeah, like you see, it doesn't really match the. So this is another one of the peaks you can see from up at Struan Point. This is, let me get this right, Ben Vracki. So this is the peak above Pitlochry. So the guys came from Pitlochry, came from that direction, so you can sort of see how close it is. It's a 11-mile drive straight up the A9. It would have taken them potentially 20 minutes from leaving Pitlochry to be on the walk. You know, it could be 20, 25 minutes. So not in any way difficult. It's an easy road. It's an easy drive, and it's a really great walk. As you can see, the views are really nice. So, did you want to go on to the next one? So that's Schiehallion. I think David struggled to the top, didn't you, earlier in the year, David? Is that right?
Yeah, my feet are still recovering.
So this is one of our local Munros. It's 3,500 feet high. Again, some people thought that was the peak appearing through the clouds. I think it's about 7 miles away. Is that right, Matthew? I think you worked it out the other day. Is that right?
9. I think it was close to 9.
Yeah, that's right. I think some of the others are 7. Yeah, you're right. I think it's 9 miles away. So, but I've zoomed in. So with that photo from the top, I mean, this is 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I think I took this, and I've zoomed in. So, you know, it's still quite blurry. You know, even when you zoom, it's not that
Giles?
clear. Yeah.
Giles, can I just ask a question? There's in the comments they're talking about Loch Erechty, which is a reservoir or a man-made loch near.
Yeah,
I know it's quite close, but you can't see it from there, can you? Because it's up the glen and round the corner. Is that right?
Yeah, it's quite a bit due west from Stureham Point. I mean, if we're taking that they parked in Calvine and walked from Calvine, it would probably take 2.5 hours, 3 hours to walk to Loch Erechty. You wouldn't park in Calvine. You could drive to Trinafor, which is a little hamlet nearby, and then you would walk. And then you would walk up to Loch Erechty. So
but you can't see it from that point, can you? It's not visible from there.
You cannot see it from any point. And there is a road that links up to down the Cardiff, which is a bit to the northwest, where you can see it because you're above it. But Loch Erechty is at quite a high elevation. It's a dammed loch. It's actually a man-made loch. It was constructed at the end of the Second World War, so it's quite high up.
Did you want to just quickly? Yeah, I'll ask a question after. I think this is the last one, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is the other Munro that you can see from the top. So that's Carnlea. So that will be due east from the top. So again, it's I don't think you could probably confuse it for anything certainly as clear as we have following Andrew's analysis of the pictures. And again, bearing in mind this was the evening, and I've zoomed in again on this picture. So I think the point of seeing these prominent peaks is that I think we could try and rule them out, because honestly, I don't think you would have the clarity you have with the image that we do have of the object. So
excellent. No, that was really good. And just to reiterate, we weren't trying to show where the spot was that we think. We were trying to rule out the spot with those. And I've got a question. How many lochs or bodies of water in the rough area have sheep fence close to them, or any kind of similar kind of fencing?
Well, hardly any, because the lochs, if you have sheep loch side, the loch acts as a natural barrier. Sheep can swim, but they don't tend to swim unless they really have to. So you don't need fencing along the side of lochs. The other thing is a lot of these lochs are at a high elevation, and fencing would simply disappear very quickly. When you look at some of the winters that we have, traditionally on higher ground, which is where we are, and so we're in the Cairngorms, you would have dry stone walls, because it was obviously more permanent. You could guarantee your sheep wouldn't escape. So you tend to have that type of fencing on quite low ground, and that's why Stureham Point is quite an exception. You don't tend to have a lot of that fencing that high up. That Sturm Point where those photos were taken is at an elevation of about 1,400 feet. And there's very little of that type of fencing up there. I think maybe it was up there because there wasn't a lot of granite available to build stone walling. There is some stone walling up there, but it was used elsewhere, I think. So that might explain why they decided to put fencing up there. So
excellent, that's great. So I'm going to move on to our good friend Strafe Wilson. Strafe actually visited Calvine yesterday, took a load of photographs and videos and sent them to me. Strafe's been looking into Calvine for about 15 years. He's visited the area about 7 times, both sides of the valley. And he agrees that he thinks the spot is quite close to Sturm Point. So what I've done is I've popped together all his photos and videos into a 3.5-minute small edit. So if I play that now, we can talk about it as we're watching it if you want. I can pause it, but I'll bring that up now. Bear with me. So that's there. There we go. So let's play this. So there's Strafe, and I believe that's at Sturm Point. So
yeah, there you see that. You can see the wall there. Did you see it?
Yeah.
The dry stone wall.
So we've got, location readings for that. I mean, do we think if it was taken across a body of water, then it should never have been reported as Calvine because they're all so far away, and they maybe would have been called something else. The actual case would have been named something else.
Yeah,
I mean, these images jump out.
Yeah, you can't walk to a lock from Calvine, in under a couple of hours. So it's just not an option. So what you're looking at there, said that's Sturm Point. So that's 1,400 feet elevation. So it's quite high up.
And we feel that this would match with the background behind the fence that Andrew saw as well, of like the hills that could be behind the cloud. And
well, I think that's where we continue our investigation, is to try and use some of the more some of the data regarding the background to try and align that with some of the hills in the background, because as was pointed out, it's hard to tell what is potentially hanging from fencing and what is the background. But I think with Andrew's analysis,
let me just get back to that.
Yeah, this to my eye is looking very promising, I have to say.
Yeah, if you notice, this
ridge, kind of, I'm moving my cursor, but with that peak on the background, with the ridge in front of it, the tree line ridge in front of it, it's looking quite promising for how I'm reading the background behind the fence. Yeah,
sure. And if you look at this angle, say this was a similar spot, and the witness testimony to Craig and the MOD was that they were crouched down or lying down, which would change the angle of the photograph to remove some of that background. So it almost does fit. Now, there are people saying, why would you trust Calvine if the location if it's a hoax? Well, David, you want to talk about that? Why we trust or seem to believe the witnesses and the statements? Not that we're saying we do 100%, but why would we? I think you know what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I do know what you're trying to ask, but I don't know how to answer it, because it seems that the argument changes every time you sort of you make a breakthrough. It's like, well, yeah, we found what we think is the location, right? Well, there must be something wrong with it, so the location must be wrong. Well, all we can say is that one of the very earliest contemporaneous documents in the Ministry of Defence file from about a few weeks afterwards, or maybe less, says very clearly it was at Calvine. And the briefing that was put together by Owen Hartup on the 11th of September says very specifically that it was taken at Calvine by 2 guys who were up on the hills. So that that could be wrong. They could have lied about it, but that isn't for me to disprove. It's for whoever is making the allegation to prove. That's all I can say.
And I think if you add in what Andrew was saying about it would take an awful lot to put something together like that. And Andrew, maybe we should mention what we spoke about before about if it was hoaxed, it would be interesting to know if the 6 images that were sent to the MOD were on the same reel, because then you've got to hoax 6 in a row. You can't just be.
I should also add that I just mentioned the actual contemporaneous documents, and the documents at the time should be regarded as probably the most reliable things of all. But if you think about Craig's very detailed account of what they told him about where they parked, where they went, is also it's consistent with what the contemporaneous documents said, which Craig had never seen until I provided him with copies. So that to me is pretty good evidence.
Yeah, I mean, the point, Vinny, that we were discussing before. So there's a number, David will know the details, but there's a number of contemporaneous reports that say there were 6 images in total. And what would be great to know from someone at the Daily Record or someone who handled those negatives is, are they on a single strip of film or on 2 strips of film, rather than being individual images, and are the frame numbers consistent? Because if you were to try and fake this in one of the ways that's been suggested, a cutout closer to the camera, hanging on threads or on a sheet of glass, or if it was something, a kite in the background that you're trying to maneuver into position to get it looking right, or something like that, then it'd be highly, highly unusual to be able to do 6 frames that are convincing, sufficiently convincing to convince the Ministry of Defence in a row. That's a kind of thing that you would really have to take many, many photographs to get it looking just right. Now, we don't know if the frames were in a row, but that would be a really useful piece of information.
Absolutely. And as we've said a few times, our investigation is ongoing. Multiple lines of inquiry, and we will update as and when. So let's watch the rest of this video, then we can jump into a few more questions. Definitely looks pretty similar.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how windy it is. I mean, when I went up there with Giles, we were literally blown off our feet at one point.
You can also see the fence post that's actually over at an angle in that last clip there, in the same as the image.
But this is the best thing to do. Boots on the ground. So, shout out to Strafe for actually getting out there and doing it. I think it's all good researching and looking at things on a computer screen. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's great. And some people don't have access to go to these locations. But, I just wanted to highlight that Strafe did some great work getting out there and putting all these videos together. So thank you, Strafe. So there we go. First comment I've just seen here is deer don't live out in the open, and there's no resident deer in Struan Wood. Can anybody speak on that?
Deer do live out in the open sometimes. You do see them out in fields.
I contacted the landowner. It's a huge 90,000 acre deer reserve called Athol Estates. They own this piece of land. They own a huge expanse over the other side of the A9 as well. And they told me that they do cull the deer on this side of the road in that area. They don't take paying guests out there, but they do it themselves. So there you go.
Fair enough. Got a point here by Professor Simon Holland. So people forget in 1990 we were all using flatbed scanners and Photoshop. It wasn't that long ago. The easiest explanation is a fake. Anybody have any comments? I mean, how many people were using Photoshop in 1990? I know I wasn't.
I worked on a computer using image editing software at the Royal College of Art in London in 1989, 1990. And it was a massive machine. And all we could do is kind of invert the image or add a false color to it. You could do very little. I was working in teaching establishments in the early 90s, and we were using, and we were pretty, we were, keeping up with things, and we were using Mac computers, and we had early versions of Photoshop. And as I said, it wasn't until version 3.0 came out that you could really do very much with it. And that was 1994. So I would say 1990, very few people would be doing anything with a flatbed scanner and a version of Photoshop. You'd be on version 1.0 of Photoshop. Photoshop was originally introduced in 1988 as a form of scanning software. So it went with scanners to help you adjust the contrast and the exposure of your image when you imported it. They were bought out by Adobe, who spent a couple of years developing it before they released it, I think in February 1990, but it was a very basic image editing program at that point. And the idea of a member of the general public, me at that time, having a computer, having Photoshop and being able to composite an image like that, I would say it's not possible. Maybe 2 years later it would have been. 3 years, definitely.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. David, can we talk about anybody that may, you've been around the location, knocking on doors, speaking to people that worked at the hotel. What can we say about what was talked about, with the witnesses and anyone they may have worked with?
I found it really peculiar after doing quite a lot of door knocking, which used to be my speciality when I was a journalist. Is not sitting on Twitter and speculating. It was actually getting out and knocking on doors and saying, "What do you know about this? Do you know this person? Can you give me a lead on something?" And I found it really peculiar. I know it was 30 years ago, but we just got virtually nothing from anyone. No one remembered anything. But then the more I looked into it, the more I sort of looked into the history of the area. And we know these two guys were working in one of the local hotels. The turnover of staff was just phenomenal, and it's like these guys were sort of people who were like jobbing chefs, dishwashers, who were moving from hotel to hotel during the summer season and maybe just staying in one place for a few months and then moving somewhere else. So actually thinking about it, it's not that unusual at all. It's very different from where I used to sort of do my stories and investigations, which is a big metropolis where people know each other and, people have known each other for years. So I think Giles will confirm that. He'd been a local resident.
Yeah, can you hear me again? So I keep coming in and out all the time. I've been allowed back indoors, so wife's let me back in. Yeah, there's a huge turnover of staff. This is a massive tourist area. So certainly in the hotel business, that's definitely quite possible that people would come in, work a summer, especially if they were very young.
Yep.
And a lot of people, they only have employment through the summer up here. Even now, some people, the season will run from April to sort of September. So we have a local castle 4 miles down the road, and that's the time it's open. So it has staff for that period of time, and anyone local, has to find alternative employment through the winter, which they do. So quite often, a lot of people up here have more than one job. So they'll move elsewhere. They'll move to another town, different times of the year. So, yeah. And
am I right in saying, Giles, that like the permanent population, tends there's the permanent population who live on the farms and the small holdings and things, but the people who actually visit the town tend to be just tourists who are passing through or people working in the hotels, and there's no sort of knowledge or things that are passed on necessarily from those groups of people who are working in the hotels to. People were saying to me when I was there, "Why don't you go and speak to the Pitlochry Historical Society? They'll know about it." And I just thought, well, they won't, because this is something that's been and gone without their knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. Just going back to you mentioned Pitlochry. Pitlochry, I think, has a population of around 2,500 permanent residents, and it swells to 8,000 during the summer, and that includes the staff who work in the town. So that shows, that shows the sort of the population difference from different times of the year. So like I said, people would come in, work through the summer, and then would go until probably the following summer. Yeah.
So did we hear from anyone that spoke to the witnesses or heard maybe about
that? I've been speaking to someone for over the last few weeks who worked with them and who's provided a lot of information that I'm absolutely satisfied there's stuff that he's told me that's not in the public domain. And I mean, I can read from a message that he sent me today, knowing we were doing this broadcast. He says, "I certainly do not think it's a hoax. Joking aside, I think that they would have been way above their capabilities. We were chefs, not Gary McKinnon. They saw something real, and you could see how it affected them after 3 or 4 days. I personally knew both of them, and we were not in the habit of telling lies to each other." Now, he may be making that up. If so, how does he know the information that he's given me that only I know from making inquiries locally?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does fit as well, some of what you just discussed with what Craig told us when he had interviewed the witnesses about they were young, they were on a youth training scheme. One of them was possibly English. It does, these small pieces, even when they stand alone, don't give us much, but put together, they start forming a picture. And of course, you can't say that that's conclusive because it's absolutely not, but it still points you in a direction which you think, we're going in the right direction. So, no, absolutely. I appreciate that. Let's move on to the next talking point. We will go to why they might be out walking at 9 p.m. We didn't cover that, did we? Anyone? Why do we think they were walking out after a shift at 9 p.m.?
Well, there's been all kinds of things offered in this respect. I think originally Nick Pope described them as hikers. Then they've been well, I mean, it's quite. Let's put it this way: a lot of the confusion is simply people drawing conclusions that might not be based on reality. It is quite possible to be a hiker and a chef, for instance, and do both things at the same time. Then there's the thing about them being poachers. Now, the story about them being poachers came from me. And it came from a discussion that I had with a member of the Defence Intelligence Staff, who I'm not at liberty to name, who dropped it out in a conversation with me about something completely different. Now, he may have been sending me down some kind of rabbit hole or sending me off in the wrong direction, but a number of people who are on this programme have listened to a recording of that conversation. And what do you think? You've heard it.
It's a casual conversation. It's certainly not planned or prepared. It would have been a hell of a lot easier for him to just say it's a hoax and be done with it. He brought the case up in the conversation, not you. There are so many little pointers that I think this guy's just chatting. He's just chatting openly and freely. There's no deception. And this is, I'm not an expert, but this is how I read it. If anybody else has anything different to that, cool.
Just back to the 9 p.m. Sorry, Dave. Yeah, I think early August up here, sunset is 9:30, dusk is 10:30. Yeah. So it's quite normal. I mean, we quite often go out at that time of night in the summer. You make most of the light, because you have very long days in the summer, obviously. So I mean, that's perfectly plausible that someone will be out that time. I said we frequently go. So it's normally a very nice time of the evening, certainly in the summer. So.
And the story from Craig that he remembered being told by them is that they'd had a long, hard shift in the, I think a 12-hour shift or something. They just wanted to get out and do a walk.
Yeah.
It was still light, which is perfectly consistent. But I do think it's a bit odd. Why would you take a camera with you? But I understand that one of them was a keen twitcher, bird watcher. So maybe he was into photography. And I think Andrew said in his analysis that it looks as if the photographer knew a little bit about photography. So there you go.
I mean, a slightly irrelevant point, but, when I was 18, and it's quite known that I used to be into skateboarding and that, and we were all typical teenage tearaways, but a couple of the lads were keen photographers who had nice cameras, played around with different film types. We'd still go and get drunk and do all that crazy stuff. But, anyone can be a photographer. You don't have to be,
They're not exclusive, are they? Photographer, hiker, chef. You can't be all.
I'm a hiker. I take pictures. I've done that for like the last 40 odd years. So yeah.
So no, fair enough. Go on.
Yeah, so the light was civil twilight, I think it was called officially.
Yeah.
And I've read cases where people further north in Scotland have, because of the way that it works, they have in the armed forces on some of the islands further north, they used to have midnight games of golf. Because there was, the light was such that you could play golf, play a round of golf. So yeah, admittedly we're further south, but so the time's earlier as well. So it's
definitely, Matthew. Yeah, even here at the end of June, sort of longest day, I can walk out around midnight and you can see, I think they called noctilucent clouds or something. It's so bright I can walk without a torch. It's quite stunning in the summer. So early August would be bright till, as I said, gone 10:30.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the guy on the phone, the conversation, it's matter of fact. He's just recounting. He doesn't pause. You don't get any indication from his tone of voice. He's so straightforward, and especially in when he's disparaging about certain people and things like that. You can tell it's sort of from the heart and a genuine recollection. That's how it appears to me.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we've just gone over the hour mark. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm going to take a quick toilet break. One thing I'll leave a question with David, if you don't mind, is, and you mentioned this actually in our initial reveal video, was again from Defence Intelligence. If, for example, it was secret technology, why are they testing it in Scotland and not over, America, all the test ranges they have out there? If you could repeat that for everyone, I'll be back.
Interesting one, yeah. Well, we just don't know, do we? I mean, I've heard several theories about this. One of the earliest I heard from an RAF. I know I've got to keep saying source, but when people tell you things anonymously, it's on the condition that you don't reveal who they are, and that's the only way that they will talk to you. And I hate having to use anonymous sources as a journalist. I always want to use named ones, but a lot of what these people say corroborates each other, and they say things. And one of the earliest things that I was told, this is via someone who knows Craig, who actually helped me find Craig. He said that he understood that what this was something the Americans had sent over that was supposed to be invisible, and it was an attempt to trigger our air defense system and to see whether we could see it. And so his first question to me was, have you found out whether the QRA was triggered on the 4th of August 1990? And I thought, what's he talking about? And Graeme, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Quick reaction alert. Yeah. So it's interceptors from an RAF base, Lucas, Watersham, or Coningsby.
Yeah, so that's what he was saying. It was a deliberate test of our air defences by something that was supposed to be invisible, and obviously it wasn't invisible.
Presumably, when they said invisible, that meant radar, not sight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you've got to also. I mean, I think Gordon Hudson, who did that bit of, he came up with a theory about it being a reflection of the mountaintop. I mean, he sort of was the first person to say to me, it's the time it happened that's significant. There's got to be some connection, because this was 2 days after the outbreak of the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. So 2 days before this incident happened, Saddam Hussein's forces crossed into Kuwait. And if you go to the National Archives, as I've done, and I think Graeme has, you look at the operations record books at all the squadrons and all the air bases in and around Scotland. They were frantic. There were aircraft doing low-level exercises. There were aircraft carriers, I believe, somewhere in the vicinity. Everything was heading down to the Gulf. So the fact that this was something military, to me, why people find that such a difficult thing to accept, I find bizarre. To me, it's the most obvious explanation. Graeme, do you want to add anything to that? You've looked at the same.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at the Harrier squadrons, so it's 1, 3, and 4 squadron, and yes, there's activity, but still wasn't really at weekends, and certainly not in Scotland, because there's no reference to anything happening that far north. So, and you're not in one of what they call the tactical training areas, which is the really low-level areas. Everywhere in the country is actually a low-flying area, apart from big cities. Even places like East Anglia, where it's flat and there's no mountains, there is a low-flying area there. But there are 3 places in the country where aircraft can get down to 100 feet, in certain times of the day, but they're all advertised in advance. And anything else has to be above 500. It can't come down any further if they're being used to 100 feet. And you're talking about the north of Scotland, north of the Great Glen, so that's much further north than Calvine. You're talking about an area of southern Scotland, kind of North Dumfriesshire, into the Borders area, and a bit in Northumberland. That's TTA, that's LFA 16T. The Scotland one's LFA 14, and then you've got a part of Mid Wales, which is LFA 7T. They're the three tactical training areas, which are really low, and they would be used for that kind of build-up, because you're looking to the point where they're getting so low that they can't be picked up by any enemy radar. And that's a good skill to keep on top of for any future conflict. So those were definitely heavily used, but not at weekends still, because the Gulf War preparations hadn't ramped up to the point that early on where they were imminently going to be sort of in combat. So I can't see any evidence of the files I've looked at to say that they're actually doing low-level intensive trainings on the weekend, but other units might have, and it might be somewhere else as well. But if you're just going down the line, the Harrier squadrons, then there's nothing to indicate that they're actually operating in that part of Scotland, or actually anywhere in Scotland at that time.
Could that lead into it possibly being something like a Hunter? Because I believe, is it 237 OCU were operating Hunters in that area at the time?
So, yeah, well, the Hunters were still being used by both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, because the RAF was still operating the Buccaneer, the strike aircraft. It had been a carrier aircraft, but we didn't have carriers big enough to be able to operate them from. So they were land-based attack aircraft, and they used the Hunter, the two-seat Hunter version of the Hunter, which was quite an old 50s design, to train pilots and navigators to fly on Buccaneers. But by 19, when this case happened, they were in the final months, kind of, within about a year of being taken out of service for that role, because the Buccaneers were coming out of service as well. So there was no point to them. I think the Royal Navy soldiered on a little bit longer with their T7s and T8s, but that was about it. The Empire Test School were flying them, and there was, I think there might be some of those on trials, etc., etc. So yes, technically, theoretically, you could have a Hunter there. Other people have said, and I've actually got a list of the types that various people have said, oh, this is what they are. So other people have said they're F4 Phantoms. Yes, they were based at Lucas, which is like 70 miles away as the crow flies from Calvine, or maybe even less. And that was one of the quick reaction alert locations that Dave mentioned there. So that's where, if the Russians came off the East Coast somewhere, those aircraft would be scrambled to intercept a Bear bomber or one of those aircraft. But they're also based at Watersham in Suffolk. They weren't based at Coningsby, because that was a different base in Binbrook as well. So there were other aircraft based at those airfields. So yes, theoretically, a couple of Phantoms could have been scrambled from Lucas to some theoretical intercept, to something that they were trying to test against. So that's possible, but that aircraft in the image doesn't look like an F4. It looks like a Harrier. The other aircraft that's been mentioned is an Alpha Jet. I think Chris Leto mentioned that the other day. But Kinetic, the kind of test evaluation people down south, they didn't operate Alpha Jets until 1991. I believe they bought 12 from the Germans. They only ended up flying 6 of them anyway. Yeah,
we do have the info from the document, which is apparently from the Jarek analysis.
Well, this is what I'm leading up to. Yeah. So this is why I'm leading up to. I'm trying to basically go through all the ones that people have said, look, this is really what it is, Graeme. It's not a carrier. It's not a Harrier, rather. So there's two things. You're right. In the documentation regarding the photo analysis when it comes back, and this is a Defence Intelligence Staff Ops Imagery Tasking Form, which was, as you say, was released by the MOD. This is March 2009. Notes on it about the viewfoils, which are the things to do with overhead projections. And there's been a request for, quotes, line drawings of object with size and dimension where possible. This is a retask of an original passed in September 1990. So they must have looked at that, and then they looked at it again. Original negatives are not available. And then if you look at the bit underneath where it says essential elements of information, the notes, which are handwritten, say task already discussed with Ops 4 Squadron. Now, 4 Squadron was a Harrier squadron. So that's where that information comes from. Jarek must have looked at that information and come up with that. However, the thing that people are missing when they're looking at just this one image and trying to extrapolate a meaning from it is there were 5 other images. We haven't seen them. We don't know what's shown on them. We don't know how clear the image is on those particular pictures. The aircraft could be much more, much closer. It could be better defined. There could be a whole range of things going on with it, and also the object as well. I mean, we're not forgetting about that.
And also, Graeme, isn't there supposed to be a second Harrier on one of them as well?
This is again something I'm just about to address. Yeah, you just preempted me. That's right. In one, they do mention in the photo analysis that there's a hint of another aircraft, possibly a Harrier, but they're not too sure. Presumably because it's maybe just a much smaller sort of representation on the film. But so we've got 5 other images that we simply don't know. But when you look at that aircraft and the image that you showed before, and you showed the blow up, and Andrew, you had the picture of the Sea Harrier FRS-1 next to it, you can see the similarity between the aircraft. I know they were slightly different types, but essentially they're the same airframe. It's just the nose is different. And on Harrier GR3, which was just coming out, that's somewhere else. That's a Tornado a Tornado F3. So here's a Harrier GR7, and it's got brimstone missiles on it. I took this in the Lake District back in the late in about 2007 or so, and that's me perched on top of a crag looking down on it, coming up the Valley of Thirlmere. So it's a similar type of aircraft. This is the same aircraft in the same kind of area, coming round again for a second go. You can see the kind of aircraft, and you can see the way it looks. And if you look at the image that was taken at Calvine, you can see it looks like a GR3, which is the earlier version of those pictures that Vinny's just shown there that I took. And the nose is slightly different. It was set up as a ground attack aircraft, so it doesn't have like a kind of air defense radar on the front, so it's not a big nose cone. It's got a very thin, almost kind of point. It's not quite pointed, but it sticks out quite a bit. And that was quite a distinctive feature on the earlier Marker Harrier. And to me, that image does look like a Harrier GR3. But you don't know what's on the other images, and I suspect when Jarek looked at it and then passed the information to DI-55, then they probably had much better information to look at and much better pictures to look at that said, yeah, that's a Harrier, because those guys at Jarek, the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center, their job was to look at imagery regarding Soviet bases to do with satellite kind of imagery and that kind of thing, and they were looking at to see what things look like on the ground. So they were quite good at interpreting shapes of aircraft, either known or unknown, to work out what things were on the ground, and all manner of other weapon systems. So they would be very, very skilled in telling what a particular aircraft was from different angles, much like your air cadets are, when they do aircraft recognition drill from different angles as well. So the really good ones can say, yeah, that's that kind of aircraft, and looking at it upside down or from the back or from the front or different angles. So you get that kind of level of knowledge through experience. And for somebody like me, who's been interested in aircraft for over 50 years, 51 years now since I started this hobby, I'm reasonable about being able to tell aircraft from certain angles as well.
Excellent. Well, that kind of leads into what we know about the analysis done by both DI-55 and Jarek at 2 different times in 2 different years. So does anyone else want to kick that off with in fact, let's address this first, because I think this is important. There's been a lot of talk about why it took a month for the images to get from the Scottish Daily Record or from Craig up in Trevi Castle down to the MOD, because we know they received them on September the 10th. If they were taken on August the 4th, then just over a month. So David, I think you're probably best suited for that.
Yeah, well, I think this is quite an easy one to address in that they were taken. There was obviously a discussion between the lads who had taken them. This is a group of 6 chefs who all knew each other, who were talking about the what had happened. My information is that one of them had a car, drove the one who'd taken the pictures to Glasgow in person to deliver the images to the Daily Record. You've then got a period of time in which the Daily Record are looking at them, the picture editor at the time. I know that the news editor, who would normally have talked about this with the picture editor, was on annual leave. So basically it was left to the picture editor to decide what to do. We know from Craig Lindsay's testimony that eventually the picture editor rang him over at Trevi Castle. There was then this sort of to-ing and fro-ing about, well, you want to comment on it, but I need to see the photos first. He then went away and ran off the print that Andrew was talking about. Don't know how long that took, but then that got sent over by train to Edinburgh, where it got collected by a photographer whose name is on the envelope, who I've spoken to. He then took it to RAF Petrevey Castle. Then Craig had to see it, show it round, talk to the guys on the UFO desk, do a photocopy of it, send it down to London. London then had to get back to Craig and say, can we get the negatives? Craig had to go back to the Daily Record, get the negatives sent to London. We don't know how long that took. They then had to sort of share it with Jarek. Jarek had to produce a report. A report had to go to SEC-AS, and that's the point at which SEC-AS then thought, oh my God, this is coming out in the Daily Record. They've got the exclusive. We better tell the defence minister, because he'll need to know, Tom King it was at the time, he'll need to know when this gets into the media what to say. So that, to me, between the 4th of August and the 11th of September, fits perfectly.
Yep, makes perfect sense. But
what's the mystery about that? I don't see any.
No, of course. I think that's great that we just laid that out. I mean, again, it does make sense. I mean, we don't know, but it fits in my opinion. So let's talk about the two analysis. Jarek, we know, did the first analysis in 1990, DI-55 in 92, and then also in 92, I think, is when the air attaché to Washington got involved. And this is where the story gets a little bit crazy again. So,
well, what I should say, Vinny, is
sure.
You said DI-55 did the investigation in 1992. My information is they were on site talking to the chefs within a couple of weeks of it coming to the attention of the MOD.
I think I was talking about the photo analysis was done twice.
Yeah, that was a follow-up one. I think when they were when they were talking about taking the images to America to a meeting at Washington.
Yeah,
that was 92.
So let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that first one, the Jarek analysis in 1990, and then if we can talk about what we know, or what you know, David, about the DI-55 investigation in 1990.
Yeah, my understanding is two officers, spooks, whatever you want to call them, from DI-55, which, as we know, was the branch of the Defence Intelligence Staff that did the UFO investigations, the field investigations anyway. Visited Pitlochry, interviewed the witnesses, maybe went to the site, did a lot of work on it, is the phrase that was used to me. And they obviously, I think, came to pretty much the same conclusions of Jarek, that this was an object in the sky, it wasn't a hoax. You know, obviously, what that means, I don't know, because we know that some intelligence agencies have been taken in by hoaxes plenty of times. I mean, think of weapons of mass destruction, for instance. You know, sometimes people tell them things and they are inclined to believe in something, and they draw conclusions that are false. They're only human beings like us. It doesn't mean to say that just because they are intelligence officers that they simply cannot be fooled. I mean, I will make that point. But they do seem to have sort of reached the same conclusions that Jarek did, and there was a lot of sort of concern about this. And the other bit of context that I should add was, at the time, shortly after this, there was a massive amount of speculation about this mythical, or whatever you want to call it, hypersonic plane Aurora in the both the local media. The Scotsman did a big expose early, I think in 1991, where it was interviewing an air traffic controller who said he'd seen some object leaving RAF Machrihanish at some incredible speed. And he'd made a call to the airbase and said, what the hell was that? And he was told, basically, keep your mouth shut. You didn't see anything. And the Scotsman did this story. It triggered off a whole bunch of questions in the House of Commons from Scottish MPs saying, have the Americans been authorised to fly and land a reconnaissance aircraft in UK territory? And obviously they denied it. But I got the files released in 2008 where they're addressing the questions, and the DI-55 are saying in the background, tell the MPs this, but it wouldn't surprise us at all if there was something flying around like that.
Machrihanish is a really, really odd place because it's right at the bottom of the Kintyre Peninsula. It's basically, its seaward side is the Atlantic Ocean, so aircraft could fly in over the sea and nobody would see them land. apart from anybody on the base, of course. The base itself, although it was winding down, it was never anywhere where the based aircraft in terms of squadrons since the Second World War. It was actually a place where the US Navy had a kind of lodger kind of presence there. They had SEALs that were based there. They were even had bunkers for nuclear weapons for storage there. So there was all kind of sneaky beaky kind of like stuff going on there, where they would do exercises. They would do things about trying to infiltrate an aircraft from an airfield from the sea at night, because it was an ideal place for such exercises. But also to have these special weapons there, which they would do probably exercises trying to guard or maybe trying to infiltrate, all this kind of stuff. And then you've got the aspect about secret aircraft, as he said there, where there are rumours, which I heard in the late 80s, as early as that, about stuff going into Mac, and yet nobody really knowing what they were. So those stories have been around forever, as concerned.
David's defence source as well mentioned to us the possibility that this thing was actually on a training exercise over the continent at one point, going into Belgium.
Well, I was told it was flying from RAF Machrihanish, and it was being escorted by British and American jets.
Mm. And there was a sighting of a diamond over Eupen, a town in Belgium, in December 1989. You know, it's only 8 months difference. If people want to look that up, there's imagery seen by the witness, and it's remarkable.
What I should say is, as well, when you look at these parliamentary questions, they never lie. They will not lie in case they get caught out. It's just how they answer the question is very, very careful. And I noticed that on the question specifically about Machrihanish, it's almost a sigh of relief in one of them that they didn't ask us about 1990. They're asking us. This is where MPs always make the mistake. They ask the wrong questions. And the MPs had said, has anything been flying experimental from Machrihanish from 1991? And there's almost like this sense of relief. No, there wasn't, because it's gone by 1991.
They can tell the truth, can't they?
Yeah. So they don't lie. It's just they're very economical with the truth.
So, here's a great question. Subman Stan says, if it's flying from Scotland to Belgium, why did it stop for 10 minutes over Calvine and Hover? It would be speculative. Well, it would be speculative as well, but we've considered the hypothesis that if it's a prototype, then maybe it malfunctioned briefly. There could be numerous reasons why.
Think of the Cash Landrum case from 1980, and the thing that in America that was supposedly I believe a diamond as well, which was supposedly escorted by a group of helicopters, not just one or two, but sort of 20 or 30.
23,
Don't forget also there was the Chris Gibson sighting, which
I was going to bring that up next
year, of a very similar object that he saw from an oil rig over the North Sea, and he was a member of the Royal Observer Corps, and he knew straight away this is not something I'm familiar with. This triangular object being escorted by F-111s and a KC-135 tanker.
And he was an aircraft recognition expert because he'd been on the Royal Observer Corps. Like their recognition team against other teams from around the world. He was really, really good at what he did.
And the witness wasn't.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, the witness wasn't stating at that instant that the craft was going to the continent. He was just saying the craft was being used in that period to go to the continent. So it wasn't necessarily that day. I mean, it could have been an engine test, for that day, and the mission over the continent was on a completely different day. When you've got I think it's 7 miles long, isn't it, Machrihanish? And it was the space shuttle abort site over on this side of the Atlantic. So, you can land absolutely anything there in secrecy and in safety. So,
well, you could certainly land something on the western end of the runway and nobody on the eastern end would see it.
Perhaps we should have Paul McCartney, because he lives down there, doesn't he? Right on the end, isn't he, of Kintyre?
I didn't know. No way. Let's touch upon this air attaché to Washington and the confusion between, and even the conversation where members of Defense Intelligence actually flew out to Washington for a meeting at the Pentagon, all over a hoax. I mean, what can we say about that? And why did the air attaché initially think it was a hoax? Is it because he hadn't seen the analysis that had been done 2 years previous?
He told me that he hadn't seen the analysis. He'd just seen the image, and he thought, well, nothing that object in that thing couldn't possibly fly. That was his. It's got to be a hoax, So he called it. I love the phrase. It's like the aerial equivalent of the Loch Ness monster, which I thought was a brilliant quote. But in the memo that he wrote, which I've got here, I got this under Freedom of Information in 2006. He says very clearly they refer to it as a possible research vehicle flying in the UK airspace. And he says the photograph, the one we're talking about, is being brought to the United States in January, that's 1992, so that both intelligence communities can look at it together. So the defence intelligence staff people from this country took the photographs over to the UK. I mean, they didn't have I don't know whether they had internet or anything at that time. They had some kind of communication system, but clearly, yeah, they wanted to look at the actual images, the prints, and it says the view. They want to look at it together, and I think this was the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA that were involved. There was a meeting in Washington specifically to look at these photographs, and it says the view from the area in Washington is that the photograph is probably a spoof and is another chapter in the ongoing Aurora saga. So obviously it was all mixed up with this belief that they were flying this thing around. But if you look at the thing, what else they say, this guy was dragged into this office by this 3-star general, and somebody else had their office searched with an armed guard to check whether they got these photographs in a drawer or something. You can't make this up. And this 3-star general was furious because because this is the complicated thing. The British defense, because they're all compartmentalized and no one will talk to anyone else. The DI had sent the images to the CIA. The CIA had then sent them to the Pentagon, their stealth unit, whoever dealt with stealth aircraft, but didn't tell them that the images had come from Britain. So this guy, this 3-star general, came to the conclusion that this was an RAF stealth aircraft that we'd built using technology that they'd shared with us in confidence. Someone had photographed it, an American, I think, and it was like, how dare you fly something like this without telling us about it? And so the air attaché had to say, no, it's not. The source is us. We sent the picture to you to say, is it one of yours, basically? So there was this high-level sort of complete confusion. This is what makes me laugh when people talk about the intelligence services. You know, they're not intelligent at all. They're all so full of their own self-importance and all these levels of security that they don't even talk to each other. So this obviously went on in 1992.
I actually messaged the DIA. The CIA just completely ignores everything I've ever sent them. Oh, yeah. So I think that's a dead end. There's no surprise. But the DIA did reply to me in September 2021. So we're coming up on 11 months now. And I did ask for a clarification last month. And they said their responses to Freedom of Information Act requests are running at 530 days on average. So I've got about another 5.5 months before they tell me they've not got anything. So
you might get that in time for the 1st of January 2076, Matthew, when they release
the gift wrapped.
Speaking of FOIAs, I've FOIA'd the records for VMM 223, which is the Bulldogs. It's a Harrier squadron, but it's a US Marine Corps squadron. Now, people have also mentioned about the Harriers, and Dave, you mentioned there's one could have been British and one could have been American. Now, when you talk about American, that's the AV-8. That's their version of the Harrier, and they've operated them since the 70s. But the ones that were flying in 1990 they're not based on aircraft carriers per se, because people have said, well, you don't see them on aircraft carriers. And that's true. You don't see them on the big aircraft carriers that the Americans have. They're on what they call the assault carriers. They're much smaller. They're more like what HMS Ark Royal, Lusty, and Invincible used to be like at the time of the Falklands. They're very small carriers, but they can operate Harriers and helicopters from these. And the US Marine Corps do have several squadrons of these aircraft. Now, people have said, well, there were no ones near the UK. And that's actually, in effect, strictly true. However, at the time of this incident, the USS Saipan, the LHA-2, was actually operating off the west coast of Africa. And there was an operation there to rescue US embassy staff from Liberia because there was something kicking off down there. So this squadron, but the Bulldogs, was actually operating from or deployed on Saipan, which is one of these assault carriers. So therefore, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that a couple of aircraft were detached from Saipan out of a complement of about maybe 8 sort of aircraft on board the carrier to the UK somewhere. It could be Mildenhall, it could be Lakenheath, it could be anywhere else, it could be Machrihani. So in terms of the spotting fraternity back then, I've looked through various enthusiast magazines, because I used to be a member of some of those organizations back then, and I can't find anything about US Marine Corps Harriers that anybody had seen or reported. And believe me, if people got, there was a kind of jungle telegraph that used to operate around there, and if anything strange came in the country, people guaranteed would know about it. And yet this, nothing.
Yeah, I've got a point here. Can Graeme say anything about Mallet Blow 90-2?
Yeah, it's an air exercise. It used to kick off around, well, twice a year, because 90-2 would be the second iteration of it that year. It concentrated on various places in the UK. Mallet Blow would often happen over Northumberland, where I used to live, and you'd see aircraft going over the Otterburn Ranges at the lower level. Is this the kind of Mallet Blow exercise? Well, having a very secret aircraft operating in an exercise like this would have been probably unprecedented. So, it was more for weapons testing, for like mock attacks against targets on bombing ranges, and things like that. That's what Mallet Blow was. There were various exercises like that, because obviously they were still geared up to try and fight the Russians. So there was a lot of stuff like that happening each year. But no, Mallet Blow probably wasn't a factor in this case, nor was probably any other exercise. This, if it was some kind of secret platform, this is some kind of one-off, something that was under the radar, metaphorically, I'm saying, and also physically as well. It was something that they didn't want people to see. They were testing it in a fairly remote part of the Highlands, where they probably thought they were going to get away with it. And somehow, one of those 1 in a million chances, somebody saw it, and somebody had a camera being able to photograph it. I wish when I was on those hillsides, because I've spent countless hours and days on hillsides taking pictures like you saw before, I wish I was in a position to get a picture like that with a kit I used to carry around up on hills with me, with 400mm lenses and all this kind of thing. So yeah.
Well, that was the phrase that was used. That it was a 1 in a million chance. They were in the right place at the right time to see what they saw.
Yeah,
they weren't meant to see it, basically.
Yeah, and you can see the difference between that picture and the kind of stuff I used to take, because I used to get advanced notices or glens that the jets were using, sometimes from the pilots, and they would maybe text occasionally and say, "I'm going to be at a certain place at a certain time. Are you going to be there?" And I'd get a picture and I'd send them the picture. So that's the kind of thing that you had to do to get that kind of shot. But you could only be in certain places to get that level of kind of that image. Whereas somebody in the middle of nowhere with a camera, they're not expecting seeing something like that. You can see that kind of image appear because of the kind of spontaneity of it. It's not a planned thing.
Yeah, amazing. And this is the thing. One of the big questions was, can't you interview the pilot? And so I hope people now appreciate that. In order to do that, we've first got to find the plane, the squadron, and things like that. It's such a difficult process. That's why
they're still alive.
Exactly. I mean, the investigation just to get to the photo part was massive.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed. I've just been skimming in and out of the questions. I noticed somebody was asking, "Why can't you speak to the people at the Daily Record who dealt with it?" Well, I'm afraid the key person, the picture editor, Andy Allen, who received the prints, died in 2007, 2 years before I even started looking at this. The editor, Endell Laird, who must have known what went on, died in 2015. These people are, I mean, I was working on a newspaper at the time. Some of the people who were sort of in the senior positions like that were in the 60s and 70s. They're not alive anymore. And, there are very few people who remember anything about it.
Yeah, and I will say there is one guy that's come forward, Stuart, who worked as a press photographer at the Daily Record 30 odd years ago. He's actually going to be live tonight on Alien Addict's YouTube channel in about 20 minutes, in fact. Now, he claims to have seen the 6 images, whether that's negatives or not. I spoke to him ever so briefly, and hopefully I'll be speaking to him privately in the week, but I'm sure he's going to talk about it a lot tonight over on that channel. So please, by all means, go over and check that out. But yeah, this is the thing. Most people have died and moved on. And also the Daily Record went through a massive change from their storage of old photographs and negatives as well, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to the current chief reporter there, and he wasn't there at the time, but he knows that, and this is the same. I worked at the Sheffield Star, which was part of the same group at the time, and I remember going into the library on one occasion, and to my horror, they got all the boxes of old prints and all the newspaper cuttings that we used to have carefully filed, all stacked up to go in an incinerator. And I had to I just rescued stuff what I could. But the same thing happened at the Daily Record. So if it is true, as the MOD say, that the negatives were sent back to the Daily Record, and for some bizarre reason they decided not to run the story, and I still cannot get my head around why a newspaper would not run a story like that. It could have been that they just got put in the negative file or something, and then circa 2001, when everything was digitized, they just chucked the lot and burnt it, and so the best negatives that could have told us something ended up in an incinerator somewhere. You might think that is just not possible, but knowing what I know, I think it's very likely to have happened.
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
they were told the same story that the people in the 1992 investigation were told, that there's nothing to this, it's an aerial Loch Ness monster, why would you bother keeping it? You're not going to. A newspaper's not going to print some photos that, as good as they look, they've been told are a hoax, represent a hoax.
But there is the information you discovered, Matthew, as well, about the editor as well, isn't there? Do you want to?
Oh,
yeah. It's again, we knew his name for a while, and I've tried to. Obviously, we knew he was deceased and tried to find him. And then by sheer chance, we got this memo that you got, David, which mentioned about the report. Another convenient dropout of information, which the MOD claims to have lost every single original unredacted copy of. This memo talks about a sighting, potentially, in which a D notice was issued. So the D notices were issued by a particular committee. And I emailed them and said, any issues of D notices in 1990 in reference to Scotland? No, there's nothing like that. Or we've got no records of anything being issued in that to date, which is more accurate. And then I just sort of sat there and thought about it for a while, and thought, I wonder who was on the committee. Sent them an email, and they sent me a list back, and I was surprised to get a list, but I was just scanning down it, and there halfway down is the name Rendall Laird. And so of the Daily Record. So, if you were poaching, you'd basically send the photographs to the gamekeeper.
I should explain the D Notice committee was made up of I think it's about 12 members, and 6 of them are press representatives, because the D notices are all about the relationship between the Ministry of Defence and the press. So it's like a revolving door in that each of the news organisations will volunteer someone to go and join the committee for X number of months. And so anything that comes to the attention of the committee that's potentially affects national security, they can talk to press representatives directly. So they wouldn't need to issue a D notice on this. They just waited for the next meeting, and Rendall had come down on the train from Glasgow, and they just said, well, we've sent you those negatives back, but there's a war going on. This is a secret military exercise. Please don't use the story. And Rendall could have turned around and said, well, I don't care what you say, I'm going to use it anyway. And there's nothing the committee could have done to stop that. It's not law. You can just ignore what they tell you. But again, it's a strange coincidence, I think.
Yeah. People think D notices are some kind of government heavy-handed tactics where you will not print anything. It's not like that, is it, David? It's actually a voluntary arrangement.
In fact, most journalists, if they really are journalists, would just being told, "Oh, this is covered by a D notice," would be, to me as a journalist, a red rag to print it. I would think, right, that shows it's a good story, then I'll print it. So as long as I'm not going to reveal the name of a British agent in Russia who's going to get killed, you have to use your judgment as a journalist as to how important it is as a news story.
No, this is why you were never on the D notice committee, David.
I can't keep secrets. Well, I have to with this case.
Gordon Hudson's name came up before. Sorry, about. What he mentioned about seeing low-flying aircraft and all the rest of it. Now, he mentioned on the replies on Andy McGrillen's YouTube channel the other day about the Calvine update I was on, and he reckons that this object at Calvine was the same as the one that had an accident at Boscombe Down in September 1994. Yeah. Now, that a D notice was actually sent for, if any of them were, because that was something that actually had an accident on takeoff and the nose wheel buckled. Now, the thing about that is, Gordon reckons that is the same aircraft or the same craft as the Calvine. Well, it's not, because in terms of what the Calvine looks as a diamond, whereas the description of the thing that was at Boscombe Down had a cockpit, which hinged forward. It also had 2 tail fins that were canted inwards, such as the prototype of the Hopeless Diamond, as it was nicknamed, the Have Blue prototype, which was the predecessor of the F-117 stealth fighter. And of course, it was spirited away to Palmdale in Lockheed's test plant the next day in a C-5 Galaxy. That's some kind of proper aircraft, and I don't think the two things are linked at all.
The D-Notice committee said they got no record of a D-Notice being issued for Boscombe Down either. Yeah. I inquired about that one.
There's a lot of things that don't have records.
Yeah, you don't have records. No, it doesn't mean one wasn't issued.
We should also add in the Condign report, there is a section on Black Project aircraft that has a picture of the Blackbird, doesn't it, the SR-71. Yep. And it says very specifically there are 2 other experimental US Black Project programs which may have visited the UK, and if people had seen them because they're so unfamiliar in shape, they would have reported them as a UFO. And there's 2 images that have been removed from the Condign report that show what these 2 top secret projects. So anyone that say, "Oh no, there wasn't anything," we know what they look like. Those have been removed under Section 27 of the Freedom of Information Act, which covers international relations. They are American secret projects that we are not allowed to see what they look like. You know,
32 years later, we're still not any the wiser of what these things are. Your lead time for, as I keep saying, your lead time for these kind of things is usually 12 to 15 years in terms of the B2 or the F-117, and yet these have never been put in the public eye, even if they just don't work. They've never been released.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that kind of, speaking of the Condign, I think, David, it's about time we did a deep dive on that. So maybe in a few weeks' time, you can come back on and we'll really dig into that. Seeing as you're the one that got that document out into the world, if anybody knows it, you do. In fact, you've got one of 4, the only 2 physical copies in the world direct from the MOD, and fantastic. So yeah, listen, we're about an hour and 3/4 in now. I just want to finish up on a couple of points, if that's okay. One question I was getting a lot is why Craig didn't come forward sooner. I mean, I spoke to Craig, David, you spoke to Craig, Matthew, Giles. Do we know? I mean, we know he had a lot of fun with the photograph over the years.
Well, he was worried about whether what he'd got would have got him into trouble with the Official Secrets Act. That is the thing that many people, former military, retired military people, it bothers them. And they're worried about the pensions. They're worried about. I mean, the thing is with Craig, he was saying, I haven't want to talk about this because I don't want coach loads of UFO people turning up on my doorstep. And the last conversation I had with him after the thing appeared in the Daily Mail was, Craig, have you had coach loads of UFO people turning up on your doorstep? No. So those fears were not rational ones. But I can understand why. I mean, just look at the reaction on Twitter. The people who God knows what motivates them. And I actually find the reaction of people on social media actually more interesting than the photographs themselves. I really do. I mean, the vehemence that some of the people attack people over this photograph, it's almost like it's been found and it's been put out there, and they're all suddenly happy for a minute, and then they're all turning. Then it's all nastiness and throwing things at each other and what have you. And so the question, why did he not come forward sooner? I mean, it's amazing he's come forward at all, to be honest, because I spoke to him about this, and this is what he was afraid of. That's the last thing these people want, is to be bombarded with people's theories and why have you done this and why have you done that? Just be grateful that we've got the bloody thing out there. Whatever it is, we can debate till the cows come home. But the thing I come across when I'm trying to persuade some of these ex-military people to talk is this reaction. They think, oh my God, we've seen what goes on social media. Why would anyone want to come out and say anything about what they know about this subject? Because they're just going to be the target for all these people with these hidden agendas, and not just social media, to be fair, mainstream media as well. They don't want TV crews. They don't. These people just want to keep their head down. And I think with Craig, it's followed him all these years. He said that like every time he drove up the A9 and he passed Calvine, he was like looking up in the sky and thinking, "Oh, is that thing coming back?" And And you know Matthew, don't you? Because you've done a bit of research on this. He carried the photograph around with him for years, and he kept pulling it out of his briefcase, almost like as a party act.
Yeah, we've got at least 3 separate, well, people who've messaged us separately, all of whom have recounted similar incidents where Craig, almost as a party piece, was on an official visit somewhere, was having lunch or dinner, and when conversation was at a lull, he just opened his briefcase and whipped the Calvine photo out and said, "What do you reckon to this?" Yeah, and we had 3 separate people tell us that this was happening throughout the 1990s. So it does seem that he was keeping it close to his chest.
And also, there's a number of other reasons why he was a bit reluctant to part with it as well. But he was quite annoyed by some of what he described as, the stories that have been in the tabloids and some of the stuff that Nick Pope had written about it. That he thought, well, that's not what I remembered. One specific point was, I think in Nick Pope's account, he talks about the guys hearing a humming noise, and he said he remembered reading Nick Pope's book in Waterstones, and he read that and he thought, that's not what they said to me. The key thing that stuck in his mind is that it was utterly silent. It didn't make any noise at all. So he wanted to correct some of the misconceptions about it. Which, the thing is, Nick was probably remembering something or mixing it up with something else. There might be a perfectly logical reason for that. But then when we get into the stage where the Sun are doing all these sort of stories about it, and there's this artist's impression that appears, it's like the Rendlesham thing. It's like a snowball that just rolls down a hillside, collecting ever more extraneous stories, and then you get all these fantasists coming forward wanting to write themselves into it and claim that they knew something about it. So I think he just wanted, probably after 32 years, this is probably the last chance to get to the truth. And like Vinny's always saying, this is an ongoing investigation, and we're still on the trail of some of the answers to these things.
Can I come in, Dave? Can I come in? Just briefly, because obviously we met Craig here in Calvine, and he's clearly a man of integrity. He's in his 80s. He's got very little to gain from this. I just felt that he wanted some answers. It was, as I said, it was something that was sort of carrying behind him for a long part of his life, and there's no financial gain for him. He was very reluctant all the way along the line. He could have released it a hell of a lot earlier than he did, but he didn't want to. He only did it when he was ready.
Yep.
There's nothing really for him to gain from this. That's I think that's important to say. I think he's 83. He just wanted an answer, which we all do at the end of the day. It's been out there, and as I said, he's probably, like David said, he's heard these little bits of information that isn't correct. As he remembered it, and that's what sort of ate away at him to the point where he thought, "Hold on a minute, I want to actually speak about this now." And I think that's where he finally produced the image.
Yeah, and he was very generous with the, recalling the information that he knew from the time about where he heard that they worked and things like that. That has given us something to work with in this ongoing investigation. So at this point, that is ongoing. That's why we aren't at a point where we can just spew everything out. We've given nearly 2 hours of information tonight. Maybe hopefully we'll get more information further down the line, and we can do this again. Obviously, sooner the better, because we want that information. But it is ongoing. It's confusing. It's hard to track people down. Matthew is phenomenal at doing that, but we've struggled. But we're still going. Little points crop up, and then we go down that lead. So we've got a hydra of things going on.
I've got to say, I think Matthew should get the award for Investigative Journalist of the Year, because he really has been outstanding.
I'd vote that. Yeah, definitely. So listen, we've got about 5 minutes before we hit the 2 hour mark. I think we have to address this. This has been the elephant in the room all along. David knows exactly what I'm going to say. The writing on the back of the photograph. What can we say about it? What can't we say about it? And why?
Okay, big revelation of the night, folks. The name of the photographer, or who is alleged to be the photographer, is written in red ink on the back of the print. Okay? And we have talked about this. We've cogitated about what shall we do with that. We've done a lot of really in-depth investigations behind the scenes to find this person. and we took a decision not to release the name for the time being, because if you think about it, that's quite a legitimate investigative technique, because we're hoping that this person is going to come out of the woodwork, or that we're going to find him through our investigations. If people come out of the woodwork and say, I'm the photographer, this is my print, then we can say, right, what's your name? And if it's not the name that's written on the back of the photograph, then it provides a bit of an authentication technique, doesn't it? So I'm not saying that we aren't going to reveal what that name is, but it's been literally 1 week, or is it 1 week or 2 weeks?
1.5 almost.
Yeah. It's too soon, Yeah. So we're hoping that somebody's going to come forward, or that we're going to find them. And I think again, over to you, Matthew, just give some idea of the amount of investigative work we put into finding this person.
We've contacted over 200 people with who of this person's name and potential relations and potential colleagues and stuff like that. And by contacted, I don't just mean found a name online. We have hunted relentlessly through databases and phone books and Facebook and Twitter and every search engine we could find, and we have found people you believed were absolutely nailed on. It had to be X. Vinny knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, I think we can say that one of them is ex-MOD.
Well, it's current MOD.
Current MOD. Yeah.
Current, yeah. And we thought, but the gentleman says not.
I have no recollection of being in Scotland in 1990.
Indeed, that's
was he a politician as well?
He was very polite, and he replied, with good grace. He could have just ignored me, but yeah, that's the word for word what he said. And so I can't prove otherwise. And
it's not Nick Pope.
No, it's not Nick Pope, and it might not even be him. We've had when we found him, we just thought, got to be. Right age, right name,
and in fact, the name, when we first Googled it, and there was like massive excitement that night, we found someone of that name with pictures of him walking in the Scottish mountains.
Oh my God, that was amazing.
Yeah,
I thought, wait a minute, this investigation has been going on over a year. What are the chances that I found it in an hour?
Yeah,
my heart was racing when I messaged you guys, and I was like, check this out.
And then it turned out he was like 18 or something.
I think he was about 30. Yeah, it's definitely not him.
But yeah, we've still got leads, open leads. Only today, I've made several discoveries. To be honest, one of which I convinced myself today that the man in question was deceased, and then 10 minutes later, my heart sank, and 10 minutes later, I discovered that I'd made a mistake. so he's very much possibly alive again. I've got 4 addresses, 3 telephone numbers, and I'll be ringing those numbers, and then if I don't get through, I'll be writing to them tomorrow. So this, we've still got irons in the fire. Definitely.
Well, I just want to say, I know it must be frustrating for people out there that we're not saying who this is, but if you think about it, when the police do an investigation, and this is a similar sort of investigative sort of route that we're following, they don't release all the information that they have. They hold stuff back because it's a method of authenticating what they're holding. And I think what we're doing is quite a legitimate sort of way of investigating this. We will release the name at some point, but if we say who it is, just look what's been going on social media for this last week. All the nonsense, all the sort of red herrings that have been thrown out. If we just cast this bloke's name out there, there is a thing called the Data Protection Act as well. Look that up. And what you have got in terms of responsibility for people releasing names without getting their permission or their consent. If we just cast it out there, there's going to be all these people, all these sort of Hercule Poirots and what have you, who are going to be trying to track him down at the same time as us. How is that going to help the investigation? Why not just let us get on with it?
Exactly.
If we can't find who this person is, we will publish what we've done up to that point. and people will learn about it. You just have to have a bit of patience, really.
Exactly. We have to be cautious because the MOD feel that it's valid enough to withhold the name for another 54 years till 2076. So we can't just be spewing it out. We've got to do this investigation properly. And that's what we've been doing up until now. So we're not going to stop, certainly change the methods now. You know, this is...
And be totally open-minded as well. I mean, people have sort of had a go at me with, why have I flip-flopped? Why did I say it was a hoax? And why have I suddenly decided it's a secret aircraft? Well, I'm changing my mind all the time. I may flip back to hoax at some point. If it turns out when I find this chef, he guides me into his Scottish croft and sort of says, oh, yes, and, you know, these are some other fakes that I've produced. That will convince me, you know, but... There is no. I don't get what upsets people about people changing their mind. You change your mind when you find evidence that convinces you that, you know, you should go in a certain direction. And if you set out on an investigation and you've already decided what you're going to find, all that will do, you'll just find confirmation of it. So if you think that there are no such things as UFOs, that it's not possible for anyone to ever photograph one, then you will validate your own conclusions.
Exactly.
And these people who are coming up with these theories about ponds and things sticking out of them, it seems to me they've got a problem somewhere, because they just simply cannot accept that it could be something genuinely anomalous. I could be wrong. Exactly. And to actually, I mean, I've been involved in this subject for 35 years. I've been involved in the unveiling of numerous fakes, UFO photographs. So I know how dangerous it is to sort of say, I think this one is genuine. And I suppose I've stuck my, you know, I've gone out there on a limb, which is something I don't normally do. But in this case, I'd written that story for the Daily Mail completely straight, just based upon what Craig had told me. I didn't go into any speculation about what it could possibly be. They threw it back to me and they said, this is no good. Our readers want an opinion. I want you to rewrite it in the first person, and we want to know what you think about it. So this idea that journalists can't express an opinion is just complete nonsense. These people clearly never read the Daily Mail. Every story's got an opinion in it. So I was asked to give an opinion. My best opinion is that's what it was. And Andrew's, I hadn't even seen Andrew's analysis when he came up with that. And, you know, he seems to have reached his conclusion based upon a completely different set of evidence using what's on the photograph, that was something in the sky. It wasn't near the camera. And that seems to sort of fit with everything I've heard from all these different intelligence, RAF, DIS sources. We could be wrong. And if it's a hoax, I'll be the first person to put my hand up and say, it's a hoax. It doesn't make it any less of a good story. Because another story in the Daily Mail saying 2 young chefs produced these photographs, went to ground, fooled the RAF's finest, Jarek, fooled the Pentagon. That's a bloody good story as well. So I'll be writing a story for Daily Mail on that. So it's, to me, so what? I've changed my mind. Big deal. Yeah. Let's get the investigation done.
Yeah. And I think at one point I should make, knowing you quite well now, David, is that everyone has you painted as this non-believer, this big skeptic. You're just open-minded, but you follow the data. I mean, you're not that. I mean, you even got a UFO on your T-shirt.
Yep, Californian one.
No, I jest. I just want to raise this point here. We've been asked if we've contacted the former receptionist at the Atholl Palace Hotel about the name.
Yep.
Listen, we're way past all that. We are past all that.
We're motoring ahead.
I can say more. I can't say more than that, but we are past all those basic steps.
Yeah, we are.
So, listen, guys, before we finish, does anyone have anything they want to raise before we finish?
If anybody's out there watching this and they know who the pilots are and the chefs are, get in touch with this gentleman here.
Yeah, or any of us, because we can all fall.
That gentleman here.
Perhaps not me, because I could do with a few days off.
Yeah,
but I just want to thank everyone who's been involved. I know I do this at the end of each of these shows, but Matthew, absolutely amazing. Honestly, Matthew, you've missed your vocation. You should have been an investigative journalist. And Andrew's photographic knowledge is just second to none. Giles's local knowledge, Graham's knowledge of aircraft, and that just leaves me amazed. And Vinny for hanging this whole thing together and making it come together, which is not an easy job in itself.
Thank you so much, David. Honestly, I've learned so much from you in the last year. It's been incredible. And getting to know you as a friend. It's so good that we actually connected and get to hang out in Sheffield as well and not just talk. Well, I say
And
not just bought
I
UFOs,
will
but we do.
treasure memories of that day that we went to Scotland to collect the
Oh, that was
photograph.
incredible.
And sitting in McDonald's afterwards. And that, we did have a celebratory drink, didn't we?
We did, and I still remember the black pudding Scotch egg on the way up that we bought.
Right, classic. Yeah.
Oh, now you're talking.
Okay, then, guys, I want to say we may do a follow-up in a few weeks, months, depending how the investigation goes. It certainly may die out on the on the social media talk, but it isn't dying out for us because it is ongoing. But yeah, thank you to all of you, gentlemen. Thank you to everyone in the live chat for keeping it very cordial. I always appreciate that. I'm actually going to be live in 25 minutes over on UAP Society with Carl Vibe and Chris Leto to interview Ross Coulthart. But yeah, guys, thank you so much. And we'll see you on the next one. I think Graeme is my next guest on my channel. So yeah,
right.
Thanks a lot, Vinny.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
we will all speak soon.
Absolutely
Take care, guys.
Thanks everyone who asked questions.